Immediate research report. We have been dealing with the problem. We have been dealing with the problems of the Holocaust ever since the Institute was founded. So that what I'm trying to present now is really the results of the first decade of research and some of the problems that we have found, but nothing definite. Absolutely nothing definite, and we are still very much in the middle of this research. Problem number one, I would say, is what do we actually study when we study the Holocaust? Is the Holocaust, to quote a very unknown American author by the name of Herbert Marcuse, is the Holocaust an aberration of the 20th century? In other words, is Auschwitz part of a historical process, or is it some unique deviation from the historical process? It's a legitimate question to ask, I feel, and I think that to that, the research done all over the world, and not just here, has a fairly unanimous answer. Auschwitz is a part of the historical process of the 20th century, grim as that conclusion must obviously sound. From there, you go on and ask the further obvious question. Is the Holocaust part and parcel of Jewish history, part and parcel of general history? To what degree, to what extent? I think most of us who deal with a problem would be inclined to say that the Holocaust is unfortunately one of the points of intersection of general and Jewish history, especially, of course, in modern times. Because essentially what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust must be of interest to humanity in general. What happened to the Jews, in other words, the murder of a people, is something that could happen again. From a philosophical point of view, this is perfectly clear. It did happen, therefore it could have happened. After all, it did happen. If it could have happened, it can happen again. But not only from the point of view of principle can it happen again. The historical conditions that brought about the mass murder of the Jewish people are historical conditions that are not foreign, are not extraneous to the experience of pre-Nazi Germany, especially post-Nazi Germany. The combination of a totalitarian dictatorship, modern technical means of destruction, and a prior historical preparation over generations, over centuries, of certain animosities, enmities towards minorities and so on, those are things that can happen again. Some of us would argue that a genocide was prevented in Biafra only in the very last second, and some would doubt even that. Some of us would argue that in Bangladesh a similar situation obtained, and that the mass destruction of the Bihari minority in Bangladesh is again another case in point of such a situation that might be termed genocide. The research into that kind of question, in other words, how can things like that happen, is therefore a basic part of any research into the Holocaust. There, the Holocaust becomes the subject of research not only into Jewish history, but into general history. And yet the Holocaust deals specifically with a particular case, namely the case of the Jewish people. And it is not an accident, I feel, that prior to the middle of the 20th century, three peoples underwent experiences that could be termed genocide or something akin to it. The Armenians, the Gypsies, and the Jews. Three people that have something in common. No possibility of communal defense, minority status, and a long tradition of enmity towards them based on religious, economic, social, psychological, and other factors. However, that is not the central point of our research here. Not because it isn't important. It is important, and therefore I started with it. It is vitally important. But that kind of research can be done elsewhere as well, and it is being done elsewhere. And we learn from our colleagues all over the world, in Germany and in France, in Belgium and in Holland, in America and in other places. There are certain areas, however, that only that can be covered almost only here, and perhaps can be covered best here. Because here, you see, we have tremendous repositories of source materials. Archives, like the Yad Vashem archive, which is a huge collection with about 24 million documents, and still growing. Other archives, like the kibbutz archives at Lochamei Getaot in the north, and Yad Mordechai in the south. Certain groups and bodies, political bodies, that collected materials from those days, and much, I would say most of it, has not been even cited yet, never mind worked over and utilized. The picture that we got of the Jewish behavior in the Holocaust was a stereotype that developed over the past 20 years, based very largely on German source materials, because they were the ones that were most easily available, physically and from the point of view of language. These stereotypes that were developed gave us a picture. The picture, very briefly, said more or less something like this. The Jews, like any other people under similar conditions, collapsed completely, as individuals, as communities, terrorized by a fantastically efficient totalitarian regime that planned their destruction to start with from some very early dates, some say 1933, some say 1925, and with a planned, systematic way they destroyed the Jewish communities, not only physically, but morally, politically, culturally, in every possible way. The Jews were destroyed before they were killed. Now, if this picture is true, then it's true, you see. Then that's it. Then, well, let's draw the conclusions from it, let's live with it, and it's a fact. We accepted it, frankly, as a fact here. A research group at this institute started actually from the assumption that this picture was correct. It was only over a period of time that we began asking questions about it. And we found out that the whole picture has to be very seriously questioned. First of all, the reason why this stereotype developed is obvious. You see, the Germans in Europe not only tried to murder the Jews, I used the expression somewhere, I believe, they tried to murder the murder. In other words, to destroy all evidence about what they did. And Himmler, in one of his speeches in 1943 in Poznan, said, to the assembled SS generals, the murder of the mass killing of the Jews is one of the greatest things that the Nazi government did, and it will forever remain a total secret. But they did not succeed. They did not succeed. And materials are streaming in, even today. Jewish materials that give the other side of the picture. You see, when you study German source materials, you are really dealing with a picture of a murder as depicted by the murderer. Any judge in any country will tell you that to judge a murderer, it is sufficient to know that he murdered, to have proof that he murdered. But what actually happened when there are no survivors will obviously not be an objective description of the fact. We are trying to create here the necessary scientific means, tools, to uncover what actually happened. As to use what every historian, of course, takes as his motto, Ranke's famous wie es eigentlich gewesen. And from there to go on and draw the conclusions. And we find some very disturbing and very new and very, I would say, thought-provoking problems that emerge. Collaboration. This is not something, you see, which is limited only to the problem of the Holocaust. Now, collaboration of non-Jews with the Nazis during the Second World War is something very clearly defined. They believed in the success of the German Reich. They thought, therefore, that the future of their various peoples would lie with the German Reich. They therefore concluded that they must help the German Reich with every means at their command to win the victory. Quisling was the obvious prototype of such an approach. Amongst the Jews, how many were there that believed in a German victory? That thought that the future of the Jewish people would be with the German Reich? That therefore they had to collaborate with the Germans? I know of two such groups. There were such groups. I know of two such groups. One in Warsaw, and the other one, believe it or not, in Palestine. But they were tiny groups. In one case, 40, 50 people. In the other case, perhaps 100 people. They were in opposition to the communities within which they lived. The overwhelming, vast majority of the Jews were trying to live through the war in order to survive, knowing, believing that the Germans would lose the war. So, as Isaiah Trunk, a great Jewish historian who lives in New York and has now published a monumental work called Judenrat with Macmillan, 1972, 585 pages of it, and he defines quite clearly there is collaboration, and that you find amongst Jews only in these two. He knows of only one of these two cases, in only one extreme case, and then you have cooperation. Now, to what extent did the Dutch officials in Holland object to the Germans recruiting for Dutch forced labor for Germany? To what extent did the Czech mayors of Czech towns during the Second World War resist the transport of Czech workers into Germany? To what degree did the French Vichy government or the various mayors and officials of the French government in occupied France object or resist up to 1943, when the French resistance became something real, to the German demands to hand over French workers for work in Germany? In very, very rare cases. This is cooperation with a conqueror, with a tremendously efficient totalitarian regime. So you have to define there, you have to differentiate there between different kinds of collaboration. Let me tell you a story which I, in such very brief reports I use because it's the extreme case and it's very indicative. Lodz, 250,000 Jews, the second largest ghetto in Poland. At the head of the ghetto, a man by the name of Mordechai Chaim Rumkowski, a vile old dictator, a man who closed the ghetto hermetically, aided the Germans in every possible way, defeated, handed over to the Gestapo any kinds, any forms of Jewish resistance groups in the ghetto. There is very little one can say in favor of Mordechai Chaim Rumkowski. If there was a Jewish war criminal, he is a very good candidate for that post. His idea, however, was very clearly defined. He said it so often. It's written down, black and white. The only way to survive, he said, was to slave labor for the Germans, because nowhere in history have slave owners murdered their own slaves. It's illogical. It can't happen. So if we work for them, we will be saved from destruction. The fact that he did not know the realities of German Nazi ideology is a different problem. But that was his policy. In July of 1944, there was one ghetto left in the whole of Poland, and that was the ghetto of Lodz. There were 60,000 Jews there. There had been 250,000. 190,000 were either handed over by Rumkowski to the Gestapo to be destroyed at Auschwitz, or died in the ghetto of starvation. But 60,000 survived. And that was the only ghetto in Poland. In July 1944, the Soviet army reached the Wisla River. They did not cross it, as many of you know, for reasons that need not concern us here. In January 1945, 7 months after that, they crossed the river, and within 3 days they conquered Lodz. And they found there 800, to be precise, 761 Jewish survivors, because the 60,000 Jews of Lodz had been destroyed in August, and 761 people were left behind by the Germans to clean up the ghetto. But the Germans had no time to destroy these. And these people were liberated by the Russian army. And now, it's not such a hypothetical question after all. If in July 1944 the Soviet High Command had fixed their line of advance, the end of their advance, not on the Wisla River, but 100 precisely kilometers west, and had within 3 days liberated Lodz, would we, or would we not, have called Rumkowski the Jewish mass murderer, the Jewish war criminal, the savior of 60,000 Jews, and created for him, I don't know, memorial foundations? Is it such an easy question to answer? It has to be asked. It cannot be answered, at least not now. But asked it must be. There were various types of Jewish reaction. And you see, what interests me now, here, the anti-Semitism of the Nazis is very important. We teach it. We deal with it. Don't make any mistake about it. But the Jewish reaction is a guideline, not only for Jews, first of all to Jews, also to non-Jews. What happens to a terrorized individual under a totalitarian regime? Does he collapse or does he not collapse? By and large, yes, there were Jewish communities that collapsed morally, communally. Why? I don't know. I have no answer as yet. Vienna, Copenhagen, Holland, there are a few. There are large numbers of Jewish communities together with their heads, with the so-called Judenräte, with the Jewish councils at their head, that opposed the Germans, or that stood up. In what way? The Germans said no Jewish education. There was Jewish education in an underground, illegal way. No Jewish social service. No food for the ghetto. But there was food in the ghetto because the people fought for it. They fought for the life. The idea of the sanctification of the name of the Lord in the Jewish tradition was changed. Not changed, adapted, say. The Germans were not interested in what the Jew believed in. They were interested in taking his life. When the Jews realized that, the struggle for life began as such. The opposition to the Germans you cannot resist by the force of arms. You haven't got the arms. You live in hostile communities. You can't. But you can resist in another way. And we now feel, on the strength of a very detailed research in large areas of, first of all, Eastern Europe, also to a certain degree Western Europe, that a surprisingly large section of Jews in a surprisingly large number of communities took a surprisingly similar attitude to these questions. And they did surprisingly similar things in these conditions. It was not passive resistance. That would be the wrong term to use. It was active, unarmed resistance of people who were not really aware they were resisting. They were just doing things that the authorities did not allow them to do. Then there's the question of Jewish resistance, armed resistance. For us tonight, I think it ought to be a minor question. Not because it's a minor question, but because when you consider the problems of the Holocaust by and large, the fact that there was a tremendous amount of Jewish armed resistance is really a side issue. Because the millions were murdered. Tens of thousands resisted by force of arms. Now, the tens of thousands are frightfully important. But the basic problem of the Holocaust is not armed resistance. But there was armed resistance. You see, this business of the Holocaust Memorial Day, you know, once a year, we have it here in Israel, which emphasizes the Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion, emphasizes really that there was no armed resistance. Because if you have 700 youngsters resisting in Warsaw to the whole German army, why, that's marvelous. But that only emphasizes the fact that 6 million did not resist. And yet there were 44 ghetto rebellions in Poland. Did you know that? There were 15,000 Jewish partisans fighting in eastern Poland. There were 5,000 Jewish partisans fighting in Poland, in central Poland. There were 2,000 Jewish partisans fighting in Lithuania. There were 2,500 Jewish partisans fighting in Slovakia. And so on and so forth. Statistics. What do they prove? They prove that there was a Jewish resistance wherever it was possible. They prove that Jewish resistance, armed resistance, was apparently not possible, and that is the bitter truth, because of the tremendous hostility of the surrounding populations in most, but not all, of the countries in which the Jews suffered their destruction. I want to come to the final and major point that I want to mention here. What kind of people were they, the Jews who lived and died there? Were they destroyed morally? If they were not, and I have tried to indicate that the intermediate research report tends to point to the possible conclusion that they were not. Then there must have been something that they had as human beings, as Jews, some kind of values, Jewish values, general values, that enabled them, or many of them, to stand up against the terror. The fact that they died in the end, from that point of view, is not the vital point. The vital point is what they did before they died. And there, I think that the Holocaust study, the study of the Holocaust, is of a tremendous importance. As of what kind of tradition are we as Jews? Because the traditions that were concentrated in Europe were the traditions that the Jewish people had accumulated over a very long period of time. When the terrible and most awful test came, what did they do as individuals and as groups, as specifically Jewish groups, as well as human individuals, generally? They proved, I think, if the conclusion that I point to will be proved correct, that under the conditions of the most terrible terror, human beings as such can stand up. They proved that Jewish communities could stand up. The other thing, which to my mind is of tremendous importance, is that the totalitarian regime of Nazi Germany, which was by no means as efficient as some historians make out, which was to some degree very inefficient, reacted towards the Jews in the light of the behavior of the nations amongst whom the Jews lived. In Denmark, the saving of the Danish Jews was due to the fact that the Danes objected. Because the Danish Jewish group, contrary to others, did nothing at all to save themselves. In Holland, where the attitude of the local population was ambivalent, where 30,000 Jews hid, but 8,000 Jews survived, because most of them were handed over to the Nazis by Dutch people, but 8,000 were saved because Dutch people saved them, proves the point even more. When you have in France 6,000 children hidden by French peasants, when you have the Archbishop of Lyon organizing a mass organization to save Jewish children, there was a possibility to act. There were other places where this did not happen. The reaction of the nations amongst whom the Jews lived was therefore of tremendous, vital importance. It is not true that the non-Jewish world murdered the Jews. It is equally untrue to say that the non-Jewish world is free of complicity, because it depends on the question of whom you are talking. If you talk about the American government, who did everything in their power to prevent Jews from entering the United States until 1943, when you talk about the British government, where we now have documentation showing that with extreme, I would not hesitate to use the word anti-Semitic attitudes, they did everything in their power to prevent mass organization of mass saving of Jews during the later stages of the war. That is one point. That is one problem. But when you have nations like the Swedes, when you have nations like the Serbs, like the Bulgarians, like the Danes, and that is the other side of the question. There are no generalizations. Any generalization that you are offered, I would view with very great reserve. One last point before I finish is, we here in Israel live in a continuation, to a certain degree, of that traumatic experience. It is inevitable that it should be so. Many of us, and this has nothing to do anymore with the research, have the feeling, and it's not only a feeling, it's a feeling that is reinforced by what we read as historians, that Nazi attitudes, desire for genocide, has not stopped with the Nazi regime. Genocide of Jews, specifically of Jews, we find it around us, unfortunately, to a very, very strong degree. Unfortunately, many of us did not believe it. Unfortunately, we have proofs of it. To take this, to root this out, to root this attitude out, is a task not for the Institute of Contemporary Jewry, not for the Hebrew University, not for Israel, and not even for us as a people. I think it's a task, it's a general task of humanity to which I suspect we are all, and we should all, be accomplices. Thank you very much. I'll now ask for questions.
Are there any questions? Arnold?
Two historiographic questions, two historical questions that didn't deal with the presentation. What is what the term resistance differ among, let's say, Poles or Ukrainians or Russians or Slovakians from the patterns that were developed in the Jewish community. And secondly, you omitted reference to the World Zionist Organization and to the Yeshua during the period. And I was wondering whether work and questions are proceeding there too.
I think I'll deal with each question separately. If you agree, it'll be... I'll have to make my answers very, very brief. Obviously, you'll excuse me for the brevity and...
Our group likes brief.
Yes, yes, okay, fine.
That's right.
I want just to state that I had 30 minutes and I spoke for exactly 30 minutes. So, the second question first. Yes, we are doing research on it. No, we haven't come up with definite answers yet. There are very complicated problems. What did they know? When did they know? What did they do when they knew? What could they have done? And so on. We are, of course, perfectly aware of the problems. We haven't come up with answers yet, but we have a group, I can say it very concretely, of 3 students, MA students who have now begun working. One of them is already, she's in Boston. Now a PhD student who is carrying on with this kind of study. First question. It's awfully difficult to answer that question, because you see, other nations, apart from the Jews, were not faced with physical destruction. At least they did not know that they were faced with physical destruction. The Jews were. So any comparison will, of course, not be quite valid. Also, stories, histories of resistance, general resistance in the different countries are very slow in coming up. We now have an excellent history of the French resistance, of the Résistance, by Henri Michel and his group of workers with whom we are in very close contact. We also have actually, this is very much part of our own work before the diplomatic relations with Czechoslovakia were terminated. We were in very close contact, and we still are in a sort of devious way, with Slovak researchers who do the Slovak uprising of August 1944, in which the Jews played a very important part, and which is very important from our point of view. That is the kind of control group that we are trying. However, we are now engaged on a very large project which deals with Eastern Poland and Western Soviet Russia. And there we are trying to go through the whole of the Soviet and Ukrainian literature after the war, dealing with the problems of resistance, to find an answer to precisely the problem that you have asked. This research is about in the middle, and I can't really dare to tell you any sort of definite result. Sir?
In your research so far, in the study of those people who have survived the Holocaust, have you been able to make any conclusions regarding the specific kinds of religious Jews they were? That is one of the things that's impressed me so much about Israel is the absolute multiplicity of types of Jews who are religious people. Are there any conclusions you could draw from your research regarding this?
Well, the simplest answer is no, but I'll answer it a little bit. One of the basic factors in Polish Jewry during the Holocaust is that the top leadership of Polish Jews, of all parties except one, a very small Zionist party which had a tremendous influence afterwards during the Holocaust itself, left Poland in 1939 immediately when the Germans entered. The top leadership left. They fled. They were afraid that the Germans would catch them first and put them in camps and so on. So they ran. In other words, it was a leaderless Jewish community on the top. The middle layer of leadership was there, but the top group left. That included the religious leadership. For instance, Meyer Levin, the leader of Agudas Yisrael, yes, Zerach Warhaftik, who is now the Minister of Religion in Israel, who was the head of the Mizrahi organization in Poland, and other such people left, together with people from all the other groups. Perhaps that is the reason why the religious Zionists, for instance, are practically non-existent during the Holocaust. In the resistance groups, in the ghettos, and I said 44 ghettos, the religious Zionist youth practically don't exist. All the others do, they don't. But religious Jews as such, yes. We have, for instance, Hasidic rabbis. There are Hasidic rabbis who say, you must not oppose the will of God. This is obviously His will. So to resist, out of the question. There is a form of spiritual resistance. Yes, you put the talit on you and you go with your family and you pray. You don't put your head down, you put your head up. But resistance with arms, no. But there were Hasidic rabbis, for instance, the famous Rebbe of Radzin, who called his Hasidim to armed resistance. And he wasn't the only one. So you see, it's a mixed answer. You cannot separate, and that I would say is a general rule, you cannot separate Jewish reaction to the Holocaust on the basis of religious or non-religious, or more religious or less religious. You have religious Jews who became non-believers as a result of the Holocaust. You have non-believers who became religious Jews as a result of the Holocaust. Any attempt to find a generalization there until now has failed miserably. I doubt whether it will succeed in the future. Yes?
Would you elaborate somewhat on your statement that the Jewish communities existed and continued to survive as communities even in their destruction? I think that's the way you put it.
More or less, yes.
Well, please put it in your own words. I frankly don't really know what you mean nor what conclusions you draw from his valiant destruction as opposed to groveling destruction. I don't quite get what you're striving at.
More or less, yes. I wouldn't put it perhaps so in such terms, but that is more or less what I mean. I'll give you an example. It will point out much clearer than sort of generalization. A Jewish council, a Judenrat, in the ghetto of Kovno, which was after all one of the largest Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, a capital of pre-war Lithuania. Kovno had a Jewish council at the head of which stood a man called Dr. Elkes, a physician. He became the head of the Judenrat immediately when the Germans entered the city. He was elected by the Jews. The Jews, of course, had no idea what the Germans were planning. The new occupation authority came, so you have to represent Jewish interests towards them. So they elected someone, and this was Dr. Elkes. Dr. Elkes got together a group of people from all the political parties amongst the Jewish population. After the first mass murders in Kovno, the Germans created a ghetto, and this Judenrat was then in charge of this ghetto. The Germans demanded that the Judenrat hand over to them children. The Judenrat refused. The Judenrat collected arms and gave it to the people, to young people in the ghetto, to escape from the ghetto into the woods. The Judenrat organized cultural activities with a specific, explicit, quite conscious aim of raising the morale of the population under the prevailing conditions in the ghetto. Theater performances, concerts, poetry readings, and so on and so forth. There was a vast library which was collected. People in the conditions of the ghetto, yes, they were reading books in a sort of organized way, if you will. Communal readings of books and so on in the East European Jewish tradition took place. Religious observance was of course forbidden. It took place under illegal conditions with the full support of the Judenrat. The Jewish police, which in many ghettos were actually Jewish Gestapo agents in the ghetto, in Kovno they were actually the leaders of the armed resistance group. Most of them died when they were found out by the Germans. They were killed. The problem, you see, is you are faced with destruction, so you do two things. And such a ghetto does two things, typically two things. One is, first of all, try not to be destroyed. You can't resist by arms, because around you there are millions of Lithuanians who won't supply you with arms, who won't help you, who, when you go through a Lithuanian city, they will hand you over to the Nazis. It's out of the question. But what you can do is to try to survive as human beings. In other words, not grovel, as you quite rightly said. Not submit to the dictates of the Nazis insofar as you can. When they come in force into the ghetto and they take people, well, there's not very much you can do about it. The second thing that you do is, after you discover what they actually are after, the Germans, and for a long time people didn't realize what the Germans were after, then of course you try to have as many people as possible escape to the forests. Others, you help them to leave the ghetto and hide with a few families outside who will be willing to hide Jews, and so on. This was the kind of reaction. Now you see, people may say this is an extreme case. It's not. I can run off a number of names of places where things like that happen, but I'm not even talking necessarily of places like Kovno. If I take a place like Lublin, for instance, where there was a Judenrat that did not resist the handing over of lists. The Germans came and just took the lists. There were lists of ghetto inhabitants. They took them and they used them. Where there was a Jewish police that collaborated with the Germans. The Judenrat nevertheless tried, under the existing conditions, without actually resisting the Germans point blank, to organize life and activities and help people to such a degree that they may have a chance to survive. This is what I meant, essentially. Yes?
The kind of question I have is the following. In your research, is there any way to identify what you might call critical events? The notion of critical mass of opposition or acceptance of conditions. In other words, can you state what makes a ghetto or one of the communities move toward groveling or valiant resistance?
That's an excellent question, and I'm afraid I have, until now, absolutely no answer, quite honestly. See, I don't want to mislead you. I just quoted the question, the example of Kovno. And not far from Kovno, there's another Lithuanian Jewish, it was under Polish rule, but it's essentially Lithuanian Jewish community of Vilna. In Vilna, you have a Judenrat that is, from the point of view of background, exactly the same as in Kovno. And the policy followed is precisely the opposite one, but precisely the opposite one. Now, I don't know as yet any answer. I'm groping for answers to the question that you asked.
Asking for an answer, I guess just clues or
Well, there are a few things. They are so tentative that it's doubtful whether one can even mention them. We have some tentative thoughts, some directions in which we are searching. Our method, I should perhaps emphasize it. Our method is essentially comparative. We are working on comparative studies. That's the essence of our work. We compare Jewish resistance here and there, Jewish collaboration or cooperation here and there. We try to compare, as somebody asked me before, where are our control groups with other national groups and so on and so forth. This is essentially the thing that we are doing. Possibly, maybe we'll be able to come up with an answer to this question. At the moment, I don't think we have one. Yes.
Frankel has a book which is titled as Man's Search for Meaning, in which he, as an analyst, looked at concentration camps that he was in, and suggested looking at the phenomenon of those who seem to be well on Monday and Tuesday staying alive, and suggested a dynamic in the ghetto of being in the concentration camp and being able to survive was a sense of search for meaning, man's search for meaning, and whether or not under these individual conditions or not, an individual in either a religious way or in some other way continues to have hope of meaning within life. You haven't really focused so much on being in the camp yourself, but you see this phenomenon as a possible link, or what do you make of that? Looking at this, is that one of the reasons?
Yes, I'd like to say, first of all, our research into the camps themselves is still very much at the beginning. There's another book by Bettelheim, which you may have seen, no? Bettelheim, no? You know what I mean. He, by the way, reaches somewhat different conclusions, yes. I cannot say that we have gone into this in any great detail. I believe that we are here dependent on future collaboration with psychologists and social psychologists who will have to examine this from the point of view of their disciplines. There are beginnings of this in Israel. There's a very big research which has started here based on case studies, and which is a sort of research by all the universities of Israel, and well, I hope that something will come out of it. I would say that on the basis of my own research, I would agree with the view expressed by Frankel. It seems from all the interviews that I have read that this is one way of explaining events in the concentration camps. Let me finish my part in this evening with a story that is, I think, opposite to what you mentioned. You see, there was it's a fantastic story because it's so simple. You have to put yourself into a different time and a different situation. Hanukkah, December 1944, in Auschwitz, and this is a perfectly true story, verified story. It was snowing, and there were 5 Jews, by the way, not religious, in a block, barracks. And one of them went out and he found a piece of wood lying in the snow. And he brought it in to the barracks, and they took a knife which they were not supposed to have. And he made 8 holes in the wood. And they took 8 pieces of carton and put them in the holes and lit a match and lit the 8 pieces of carton and sang Ma'os Tzur Yeshuati. I always think that that is perhaps more significant than an equal number of Jews fighting with arms in their hands in the forest. I may be wrong, but that's my impression.
Thank you very much. We have 3 parts in our program this evening. The first part was to actually visit the Institute and see some of the Center for Documentary Center in Oral History and in Demography to get a general picture of the center. The second, we decided to deal with the Holocaust because of the work of the Institute, as well as the implications of the Holocaust for understanding Jewish life and Israel. And finally, for the first time perhaps in our seminar, we would like to involve you, and we are really looking for your guidance and help in an area which is of great concern to the Institute of Contemporary Jewry and to many of us in the United States. And that has to do with the study and teaching of contemporary Jewish civilization on American campuses. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar that there has been a proliferation of Jewish studies on American campuses. In this particular subject that we would like to involve you in a discussion, in our concluding part, we are not referring to the Judaic departments or chairs as such, but we are concerned with the general disciplines on campuses in terms of introducing contemporary Jewish civilization into a variety of curricula and departments and disciplines on universities, as well as the possibility of the growth of special courses and work related to contemporary Jewish study and civilization. Now, we felt in discussing it with Professor Davis and the other members of the faculty that you could be helpful to them in this particular subject. So this part, Professor Davis would like to talk with you about and involve really your participation and input. But before I do it, there were 2 members of the faculty who were not present when we were in the other building and were not introduced to you, and I'd like you to, those of you who didn't sit at their table, to have a chance to meet them. One is sitting here. Would you stand up? Chaim Avni, who is a specialist in South American Jewry, in addition to his many other qualifications. And sitting here is Professor Simon Herman. Come on, Simon, stand up. Professor Simon Herman, a social psychologist. One of his fundamental research, by the way, he deals with Jewish identity, and it may be of interest to us, research which he did in Israel on Jewish identity of Israelis and Jewish identity of American students, and a book that was published by Random House called Israelis and Jews, a study in Jewish identity, Jewish identity. It's a very significant volume, and I recommend it to you whenever you have a chance to read it. I'm not mentioning, by the way, other books which the Institute of Contemporary Jewry has been sponsoring with Random House, a whole series of books on contemporary Jewish civilization. Professor Davis, you want to take over and involve this group in a real give and take with you?
We'll see. Thank you very much.
Do you want to stretch?
Yes.
Shall we do that?
I agree. I suggest it, as a matter of fact. Very good. Sure. It's indispensable.
אחד, שתיים, שלוש, 10.
Let's go.
I purposely didn't give you a long biographical sketch of Professor Davis because we don't have time and it would take me a very, very long time. But in the course of his conversation with you, I'm sure you will find out more about him. But before he starts, there's a charming lady and gifted lady that I'd like you to meet who's been sitting with us, Mrs. Davis.
Mrs. Davis, ladies and gentlemen. As I was sitting in the wings here, waiting my turn, I reflected that I'm committing at least 2 sins tonight by starting at this time. In the first place, I'm sure that you would have wanted to have the benefit of a continuing discussion with Dr. Bauer on the subject which he handled for us with such depth and integrity of scholarship. That opportunity may be given to you at another time. Secondly, I was saying to myself that my friend Professor Herman will now have another question to add to his questionnaire on Jewish identity. And that question is it indispensable for your Jewish identity that when you come to Israel, you devote New Year's Eve to a discussion on contemporary Jewish civilization? As Yehuda Rosenman indicated to you, when we planned the program, together with Resnikoff and our other associates, it was our thought that tonight we would be talking as pros, not professors, but professionals, one-to-one, and that we would have an opportunity to take up with you, as the chairman indicated, a problem which concerns us at the Institute. Normally, you might have expected that my speech would have come first. That is to say that we would have had a more prolonged presentation by Professor Bauer on the scope of the Institute. And we would have moved along to some of the materials. We thought, and I hope you agree, that we planned properly, that we would let you first of all dip into some of the resources at the Institute, and I say dip in advisedly because all we did was show you a small segment of this documentation bank which has been assembled in the course of the past 13 years in the research on the subjects of contemporary Jewish life and institutions on a global basis. It was then our thought that as you heard and followed, in addition to the opportunity to meet you informally, and for you to meet some of the members of our faculty, that we would discuss one subject, or have a discussion lecture on one subject in depth, and that seems to be the subject, as far as my own inquiry indicates, on the American campus, which has taken hold more than any other subject of contemporary Jewish life, including local studies and of American Jewish life, and even of Israel, not only in Israel, but also on the American scene. Now, obviously, the field we're talking about as a field of inquiry, research, and training and teaching is much broader, and by now you've heard some of the phrases bandied about, but we function primarily through certain disciplines in the humanities, such as literature, thought, contemporary history, as you heard tonight in this particular lecture, And in the social sciences, through social psychology, sociology, economics, and demography. There is a varied development in our field. I wouldn't put them all on an equal plane of development, because it is important for us to understand that the general field of contemporary civilization has not been developed, not only on the American campus, but on the in research institutes generally. We have the schools of for the study of the past. We now have an evolving school for the study of the future. We have not done very well, it seems to me, in studying the present in terms of the perspective of our own times. And of course that is reflected in the fact that in the Jewish people who don't hardly even have a word for the present, they use the word hoveh, but who is a future-directed people, past-oriented but future-directed, we too have not really developed any scientific study on a level in which some of the other fields have evolved. So that we are quite fresh and quite new, and what we have shown you tonight is a result of gropings and probings in which in some areas we've done better than others. Now, the purpose of this meeting this evening, which originally was planned to spill over also into a morning session, but that may be eliminated. We'll determine that in the course of the next half hour or so as we move along and as I get some of the comments. The purpose of this evening session is to discuss with you some of the ways in which we feel these studies of contemporary Jewish life and institutions can be extended on the American campus, and actually to learn from you how this might be done, but even more particularly, what should be the role, and I want to put a word before the role, I want to say the limited role, the direct but limited role of our schools in Jerusalem here in connection with the development of this entire field. Now, it seems to me that the best way for me to start in talking to people like yourselves is to pull out some of the preliminary material that I've gathered. You'll be able to look at it later if we have the time, or if we agree on a morning session, you'll be able to look at it more carefully. Now, there are several models which are already emerging on the American campus, and these models are now quite varied. The first three models relate really to that which stems from the Judaic interest, or not only Jewish institutions, but the Judaic interest on the campus, which I need hardly tell you has developed in unprecedented form in the last 20 years. The first model is that new development with regard to Jewish institutions. Now, there were in the United States about 14 teacher training institutions, Jewish teacher training institutions, in this post-war period. There were only 3 before that, but there are about 14 now, again of different various levels of achievement. Most of these Jewish institutions are dwindling. I mean, talking the teacher training institutions, even some of the seminaries are dwindling in their central importance, which they played on the American scene, American Jewish scene, at the beginning of the 20th century, and right up to, I would say, the 50s. And so progressive and imaginative people are taking opportunities given to them by the consortia plan, which is evolving on various campuses, to become, in a sense, the agents for universities in their Jewish studies. That model can best be seen in two institutions. I have before me a schedule of classes of the University of Southern California. Now, the founders of the Reform movement would never have dreamt that the day would come that they would have a branch in Los Angeles which would be accepted by this University of Southern California. Some of you know its history, and that it would be willing to include in its bulletin a list of Judaic studies which the Hebrew Union College organizes, and not only organizes, but by the will of the president, or the degree of the desire of the president of the University of Southern California. Many of these courses take place on the campus of the Hebrew Union College branch in Los Angeles, which is now housed very close to the USC campus. Among those studies, just go on this model as quickly as I can, you will find a survey of Jewish history, and you'll understand in a minute why we discuss the Holocaust from an academic, that is from a research point of view today, because invariably, every one of the models I'm talking about has the Holocaust as one of the central courses which is given. So the second one is the Holocaust, patterns of Jewish culture, Jewish life through music, where Judaism differs, survey of rabbinic literature, and so on. In other words, at the U of C you can get degree, you can get credit courses, and this is being developed now in Baltimore. It's being developed very significantly in a rather amazing adventure. I call it an adventure of the Spertus College in Chicago, Judaic Studies in Metropolitan Chicago Colleges. This Jewish institution is now the agent in the state of Illinois for 20 to 30 universities for which it supplies faculty and so on. And so, as I say, this would be model number one. Another type which is developing naturally the reference has been made, and some of you feel it on your own campuses, are the Judaica departments. Now, these Judaica departments do not follow any particular design. A Judaica department may have a specialist, as let me pick the classic examples of them, so that you, let us say at Harvard, where Professor Twersky follows in the great, he occupies the Litauer chair, which Wolfson started, or Professor Barone at Columbia University, now occupied by Professor Ancori. In this particular model, a cluster of courses are developed by, a particular authority in Judaic studies who was added to the faculty and given this special assignment. And the Judaic department will grow in accordance with the knowledge and the standard of this man's individual scholarship on the campus generally. Now, a third, of course, and a very interesting one, and one which I think is going to require exploration, is the free university style. Now, I think one of the best folders I have on this material from the Free University is the one at Temple. There, some 15 students, is somebody here who can perhaps with regard to all of the other models, be able to indicate, give me as we will need, some additional information. These are courses in which, whether it was faculty design or whether it was student design. Is there somebody here? How many of you are from Temple? What? Wonderful. All right, the Beis HaMikdash is here, and so I'll let you, as we move along in the conversation, either one of you tell us what's going on at Temple, but it's not only at Temple. Come right in, boy. Okay, one kudo for you, okay? For both of you. In any event, what I want to come to now is the development in two other models where I think most of you will be able to help us. And that is the what I call, for want of a better name, the interdepartmental structure. It's some universities where they do not have specialists in Jewish studies, or either from the point of view of budget, or even more serious, where a particular department head under whose umbrella the faculty would want to place a Judaica department will resist it, as in various institutions around the country. Some of the Jewish faculty members have found ways of introducing courses on Jews and Judaism in the contemporary period into their own departments. Now here, I did spend some time looking into this at the University of Washington. At the University of Washington, where a decision has not been reached in Seattle, which has not been reached about hiring or taking on a Jewish studies specialist for a variety of reasons, which I don't want to enter into now, a faculty committee consisting of really, I would say, committed Jews who have a special interest to develop courses on Jews and Judaism on their campus, have convened with the approval, and as a matter of fact, almost with the help and full support of the administration. As a matter of fact, at the University of Washington, the first courses started out of the free university design, and there were so many students registered for the courses that these faculty people were encouraged. In this case, I very much want to mention the name of one individual, because he happens to be the head of the Department of English Literature, Edmund Alexander. And I find that he is giving a course. I have a whole listing of all of the courses that are given there, in which he is giving a course on the Holocaust, and he's, as a matter of fact, selected the literature in Yiddish. He reads Yiddish very well. And he has had this material translated, and so that it's part of the literature department. The English literature department gives courses on the Holocaust, translations from Yiddish literature. Also, he convened a group of people, one in history and one in social science, and each one gives courses in their individual departments. Now, this is a rather novel thing, because there is no rubric. I'll read you one passage which I think is interesting to you from the point of view of not so much university politics, but university polity, in which he says, since departments normally take shape around particular disciplines or approaches to data, a department, and he underlines department, of Jewish studies would seem to us a contradiction in terms. Some universities are in the process of establishing what seems to us more justifiable centers of Jewish learning, in which specialists from several disciplines are brought together to work on Jewish and Judaic material. Such institutes of Jewish studies are analogous to the Russian Institute at Columbia or the Middle East Institute at Harvard. Now, he didn't pick the Russian Institute at Columbia out of a hat, because in the history of the University of Washington, which always becomes a problem in terms of the history of individual institutions, they have a fine Department of International Studies with special emphasis on Russian studies and Far Eastern studies. And it becomes almost a natural for this particular institution, when they begin to work on problems of location, departmental location, to want to suggest that the Judaic element be under the rubric of this particular department. Now, I have here too a rather long memorandum. This is it. Long statement of Bryn Mawr, in which the president took the time and the trouble to develop an entire scope for the teaching about Jews and Judaism, but there he would want to place it under the rubric of the Department of Religion. And at Oberlin College, where again a new design is being evolved, a design which I have right here, There they want to relate it to the Near Eastern studies. And so it's actually a proposal for Judaic and Near Eastern studies, courses offered in 1972 and 1973. The interesting thing is, as I come to this Model 4 and 5, which is what I want to discuss with you from the point of view of the general disciplines, that when you read the courses of instruction which are given, if you evolve typologies, you will see that they will teach Israel, Hebrew, Holocaust, and essentially the sociology of American life. Those become the four main subjects which are discussed. So under this, what I call the interdepartmental typology, we have a variety of examples in which, depending on the interest of the leading faculty member who probably has exceptional status on the campus, and also the specific history of the institution, you find the problem of location solved in different ways and in different patterns. Now there is the final, I wouldn't say the final, but at least the fifth model that I have discovered. You may be able to offer additional ones to me, and that is the location of the study of Jews and Judaism or contemporary civilization in general studies. By general studies, I mean that in the general department of history, units would be of, let us take the Holocaust, if there's a course on totalitarianism, let us say, then a unit relating to that subject is developed. And I have examples here for those who might be interested to look at it from Indiana University, from the University of Wisconsin. In this case, Brandeis and Yeshiva fall oddly enough into this particular group because most of the courses are taught through the general disciplines. As far as our institute is concerned, we also have a need to look at the development of these courses not only on the American campus but also in Europe, and the same thing, it seems to me, is occurring there. Now, the questions I would like to put before this group for our discussion are the following. If you grant that we can be of some help to the development of these courses in syllabi, personnel, and so forth, what should be the legitimate role of our institute? And I emphasize the legitimate role of our institute in this enterprise. We can, of course, say that basically we could be a documentation center, kind of a data bank, because it is true that, at least for the present, from a global point of view, we have the best resources available. But in this era of duplication, photo duplication of materials and so on, it's not very difficult to try to send over all of this material to other centers. And so we could very easily serve in that capacity, but not, and also by inviting individuals who have a need or a desire. For example, Professor Moshe, well known in the field of history at Wisconsin, comes here regularly. As a matter of fact, teachers will be teaching a course here every second or third year because he wants to avail himself of the material. Tonight, Franklin Littell of Temple will be coming here, actually arriving tonight, and he'll be participating in some of our courses. I can mention some of the others who feel that it's important to come here simply to get the material, the resources, and then go off on their own as they best understand. We can, or as I put it actually as a question, can we or should we assist in the training of personnel in these areas? We do have, and you'll find a page about that in your kit, the Bauman Fellows. It's our notion, it has been our notion, that if a person is getting a degree at a university, any university, and his general degree in history, and if he has to do some specialization in a field of our competence, that we do have fellowships available for such a person to come over to work not under our guidance, but he will get his degree from the particular university and the professor under whom he's working, but he would be doing he does supplementary work here in terms of the particular thesis which would, if we can help him. That doesn't, you can't do it for everyone. It's only in, as I say, in the field of our special faculty competence. This is a second possibility. A third possibility, and one which has come out of a similar discussion I had with a group of people at Wayne. We have somebody here from Wayne.
We have.
Were you present I don't know whether you were present at the time I met with the people at Wayne last year. There was a group of people I met with, out of which and a suggestion came that we might bring over those people who are interested in developing courses in the subject for a summer, at which time they could use our material, and then of course create the syllabi for their own work. It was pointed out to me that naturally these syllabi would have to be directed and related to the courses which are being given on the local campus. Now, it's on this canvas of that I would like to benefit, and we would, all the members of our faculty here would like to benefit from your advice. And if I may suggest, I would like it to be divided in two parts. First of all, in terms of the categories which I've suggested, are there other categories, or are there any modifications of these units in ways in which we can explore the further development of contemporary Jewish studies? And secondly, if we can get beyond that, what might be, and I think that would be for a more limited group if there are individuals who are interested, what might be some of the concrete relationships which we can establish in this work? We have been in the course of our work here. Many people will write us and tell us, "Can you send us courses, outlines, syllabi?" It's not only that our syllabi and all of our material is in Hebrew, but obviously the situation is altogether different on the American campus. And what we would like to know is, and to get your help tonight in the discussion, is precisely how we can help, if we should be able to help, and if not, what other steps might be taken on a cooperative basis in order to advance this work on the American campus. I'll pause at this. Yes, sir.
May I make one suggestion that I can only relate to my own field, which is literature?
You're in Baltimore?
Yes. There is, last week we had a chance to listen to A.B. who's one of the popular Israeli writers. And I'm getting the impression that for the first time really there was the emergence of an Israeli literature, not a Jewish literature, but an Israeli.
I want to interrupt you only for one reason. I'd like very much for these comments to be recorded, and is there any way we can solve that problem? What?
No way I can solve it.
No. I'm asking, not you, I'm asking the person who's been helping us with the machine. All right. Would somebody be willing to record at least the question?
Well, the suggestions.
At least the suggestions? Would you? All right. Thank you very much. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I wanted to record your posterity.
I teach a course which deals with contemporary Jewish writers in America who are, there's really nothing by your standards, I think, that would make them Jewish writers other than the fact that they had Jewish mothers.
Whom they hate.
The point is this, and the opportunity seems to be right now before it's too late. With the emergence of these young writers who do have a kind of nationalist beginning of nationalist literature, I was rather surprised to find that Mr. Yehuda told me that only one of his books and one of his short stories has been translated into English. Now, if I would like very much to be able to teach some really modern Israeli writers. But the fact that there are no translations, very few translations of the work, makes that impossible. I don't read Hebrew, and I couldn't do the translation myself. I would suggest, perhaps, that one of the things the Institute would do in the area of literature is to see to it that these things are translated into English and are made available to English departments throughout America.
I want to tell you, I appreciate that remark very much. It comes on the heels of a conference we had. I mentioned that we were at the University of Maryland, the Association of Jewish Studies. And these meetings are of tremendous help to me, and then I bring it back to our people, because I discovered that the areas in which we happen to be particularly strong are not necessarily the areas the materials in which we're strong, not necessarily the materials which are needed in your work. And I came back from that meeting and told my colleagues that in two areas we've just got to do some work, and one is in the whole idea of thought and philosophical ideas, because many of these courses are taught in the religion departments, and the other is in literature. Now, what you say is, I think, very pertinent. I don't know whether it is the responsibility of the Institute, but I would agree, I definitely agree, that it's somebody's responsibility to see to it that there are proper translations, adequate translations, which in the field of literature. And I will take that. I mean, I want to consider it not, as I say, for our own institute necessarily at this moment, because I don't think we're qualified. Let me put it this way. We would have to create in Israel a school of translators, because you don't translate, as you know very well, from one language to another. You have to translate from a culture to a culture. And to take the most complicated one of all, namely Agnon, who has really not been able, they have not found a person who is qualified, who really has managed to do for Agnon, I'm using another example, what Maury Samuel did for Sholomash. Maury Samuel made Sholomash famous. Nobody read him in the original, but he managed to translate a culture into, and it was his translation that put Sholomash's books into the American. A singer managed to find a translator with whom he works regularly in order to do this. Elie Wiesel is, I don't know French that well, but what? He doesn't write. He writes in French. He writes in French. And all his, as a matter of fact, if you read, I read the reviews of his book in French, they say that his French sings much better than, and he is far more impressive in French than he is in English. So that this is a very serious problem in translation in general. I don't want to go into the figures. You know that is much better than I do. But I know we have a serious problem, and I'm glad you raised this. Yes, please.
You mentioned the fact that one of the areas of paucity in research on Jewish studies relates to the certain contemporary matters. And I might just add also that in hearing a lot about the research, a good deal of the research is of a non-empirical nature. It's not what some of us call, I guess, action research. I think I'd like to suggest the possibility of an extension of research of an action nature, trying to understand how, in an active way, organizations such as AJC and other organizations trying to achieve objectives of the kind of this program, what techniques succeed or fail in raising the level of Jewish consciousness of people that may have difficulty with addressing that issue for themselves. In other words, I'm suggesting some evaluative approaches on various techniques being used to raise the level of Jewish consciousness. It's a much more action type of research methodology.
I'd like to answer this briefly in two parts. I have the answer given in two parts. I'd like to just say a few words about the second, and ask Dr. Herman whether he wouldn't address himself to the first part, because this is much more in his area. I know that there is a newly, I read in the paper, that there's a newly created committee, department at the American Jewish Committee that wants to relate itself to this, to action research. We, on the whole, have been very scrupulous about not entering into the field of action. That is, we are a research and teaching institution, and we have enough trouble trying to do that well. And the decision aspects or the action aspects of it, we assume that Jewish agencies around the world will follow through. And there are now, as a matter of fact, the new word on the American scene is task force. There isn't a major American committee today, national committee, that hasn't created its own task force. But would you want to direct yourself, Professor Herman, to the substantive question, part of the question?
If you would, I may say that in our social psychological division, which is very heavily influenced by the tradition of Interviewee, who really is the founder of the field of action research, our approach is to a very large extent an action research oriented approach. By that I mean an attempt to fuse the fact-finding and the action processes. And as a matter of fact, our kind of research that is built on the embryo-diaspora relationship, as we pretentiously put a name on it, term on it, a teaching, training, action research process. In other words, what we are doing is to intervene teaching, training, and action into that one integrated approach, which I think is important. Now, I just say, I don't want to go into it, I believe that action in this sense doesn't mean to say that we undertake the action the agencies will have to do. But what we do is we so develop our research in a way that we develop it by involving the action agency that the facts move into action.
Thank you. Yes. Sir.
I don't know. I don't.
Would you be good enough to mention your name? We do want to have it recorded.
I'm Sam Fair from Georgia State University.
Yes.
I don't think I'm asking. I know I'm not asking a question, but I have two reactions.
Please.
So far. One is the emphasis and that you appear to wish to make the development of departments and institutes in America today study. I personally have problems with that. Georgia State University, within the last year, through the Dean's Initiative, began to look at religion within Georgia State University because there was a lack of it. What that means is that he knows out of the state legislature that he can get dollars for the Department of Religious Studies, and dollars are tight. Therefore, with great academic equality and democracy, if you read their report, naturally, religion is not going to be taught at Georgia State University. It just will look that way to the legislators so that they will get money. And because we want to be totally equal, we will throw in some Judaic studies in the process. Now, with the emphasis and the strains that are going on in regards to academic freedom and budget cuts, etc., I'm somewhat concerned about what the payoffs are in terms of higher education in America. If we get our Judaic studies, what's everybody else getting? And what happens in America to true separation of church and state? I find, in my own personal experience, the more schools talk about academic freedom, the less they seem to have. And the more they talk about separation of church and state, and how you're not going to have religion being taught, etc., and the more the student becomes vehement about how these are totally going to be academic subjects, the more suspect I have. So I'm not sure, while I believe that the subject matter should be taught, I don't see why it's got to be taught outside of individual academic departments. And I'm not sure I would be personally in favor of trying to intervene to increase the departments of study. The second kind of comment I have also is that when one begins to want to generate research and activities in such areas, the easiest people to spot tend to be the stars. And the easiest institutions sometimes to make input and impact tend to be the star institutions.
And my only point would be is that I would be somewhat concerned about that. That one doesn't, you said that if you want to begin a program at an institution that doesn't have one, it is easiest if you can get a star on the campus, become interested in wanting to develop it. But I also think in terms of long-range goals of scholarship and of continuity and of flexibility, etc., that the STAR system has certain problems inherently. So I don't think either one of those are
I hope there hasn't been a failure of communication on my part, but I'm glad you raised the point because it gives me an opportunity to restate what I had wanted to say about the. I was indicating that the Judaic Studies program programs are evolving on many campuses for whatever needs those campuses may have. For example, in the New York City system, a city college has gone into it in a very extended way. Brooklyn College today virtually runs in terms of the curriculum, which I found, virtually runs a Judaic Studies program like our Institute of Jewish Studies right here at the Hebrew University. It's very extensive, and they're adding faculty all the time. Now they have the reasons for this development is not only the legitimate concern for the study of the Talmud and Bible and Jewish history and modern studies. So that I also feel that it's important for me to stress that if you were talking to let us say a man like Jack Neusner at Brown, and you made that comment to him, and I happen to be on your side, certainly in terms of my subject, he would say, "What are you talking about? If you don't introduce the teaching of Judaism and its historical development, then you are not developing the entire religion department." Has a very extensive program because he doesn't have the problem that a state university has. So we have to differentiate between, even in terms of the problem, a state university and others. Now, as a matter of fact, my example of the University of Washington precisely fits into your pattern. One of the reasons they cannot put it in the religion department, they would prefer to put it in the history department, is because they are a state university, although actually the umbrellas are really falling to and that thing. Tonight, what I'm trying to deal with, and I feel, certainly as far as contemporary Jewish studies are concerned, and I really shouldn't even use that word. I keep on using the phrase, the best one I've been able to find is the study of contemporary civilization, Jewish civilization. There might be a better phrase, there probably is, but I feel that that's the best rubric. I'm interested in getting it in as legitimate subjects in the general disciplines, but legitimately. So that the two examples this was Unit 4 and Unit 5 that I suggested, namely either on an interdepartmental basis or through text material, proper text material in relationship to subjects being taught, let us say, in history, sociology, and so on. Now about the star business. What I had, I think it is true, at least, I don't say it's the best thing, but I think it's true, and you can correct me on that, that when a professor with standing, in that sense a star, standing in his own field and commitment to these courses, when he proposes it to whatever the governing body there is, whatever faculty governing body there is, he has much more of a chance of getting it in to the curriculum for the breakthrough period than others. This has been the pattern in the past. I would certainly, however, definitely agree with you, and that's one of the reasons I'm talking. I was so anxious that we have this conversation. As a matter of fact, I'm talking to Yehuda Rosamond that I want to work out a kind of an inventory of human inventory, if I could use that word, of people who on the campuses, their numbers are in the hundreds, if not in several thousand, of individuals who want to introduce these courses, and these are the people who normally we do not reach. And it seems to me that one of the things we have to work out some method of being able to reach the future stars on the campus who have a real basic interest in these subjects and help them work out the syllabi. And that is why I suggested that perhaps one of the ways of doing it would be to bring over a group of people who want to teach these courses, spend the summer, look at some of our material, for them to create the syllabi there. Sir.
I can't help but have a feeling of kind of promotional activity taking place, a kind of public relations kind of activity. Perhaps is a rhetorical question, but my sense of it is there's a prior question to your question. That is to say, why should we be concerned about promoting Jewish studies, particularly in the departments, perhaps that we're affiliated with, and so forth? Perhaps this is in the introduction, in your introductory material and so forth, but I would be very interested in hearing from you as a person who is obviously concerned about the subject, what purposes you see for this kind of activity. Why should we be concerned
I accept
about
the validity of your question. I really do, and I also feel that there will be answers on both sides. I mean, I can only speak for myself. Sure. I'm going to speak for myself.
I've been sitting here worrying about my Israeli colleagues who are distinguished members of the faculty, and I not quite certain about what their role is in this conversation. On the assumption that we're not exclusively talking to you, but talking to the institution that you head, I wonder if we could also involve some of the faculty members here in having them either raise questions or respond.
You mean my associates?
Sure.
Sure. Well, let me start with, is there any, Avni, would you want to answer the question? Herman?
I would be particularly interested in hearing your response.
I didn't mean to cut that off, but I just wanted to broaden the focus of...
No, one of the reasons I thought it would be helpful to have my colleagues here is because we have to think this thing out very carefully. The practical question, let me take care of the promotional part. People address questions to us and requests to us all the time. And from my direct contact, the contact of the members of our faculty, there are at least several dozen places where they want to introduce the teaching of these subjects on the campus, and they turn to us. My problem as head of the Institute, and the problem of my associates, is to find out what we ought to do, what we really ought to do, and whether this isn't something which the people in the United States ought to be able to work out as they understand, or whether we do have a role in this. I want to tackle that promotional thing right away. We are not, on the contrary, our problem is not to drum up business. Our problem is to carry our responsibility as we understand it, and to respond to those who are turning to us. And I think it's important for you to know that they're turning to us in very, very large numbers, far more than we can manage to cope with, because the thing is just springing up everywhere, and in a rather inchoate way. Now you ask me another question. You ask me a kind of a personal question. And my answer is as follows. As a Jewish educator, I'm an educator. My answer is that there are the estimates are now, and they're growing all the time, that about 80%, what's the latest statistic? It changes every year. 80% of college youth, of Jewish college youth, of age, of the Jews, of Jewish youth population, get a college education. 80%.
In fact, it's higher.
It's higher. It's higher. 80%, as a matter of, well, I don't look, there's no sense. It started 10 years ago, it was 65%. some people say it's already 90%, and that it's going towards a ratio where almost be 100%. In other words, I'm now speaking to Jews. I think, and the statistics change so radically, I think that that's in comparison to 40% of the general population. Don't hold me to that particular statistic, but yes, sir, do you have the correct statistic?
No.
Okay. Now, as a Jewish educator, I find that there are many of these. The approach in terms of being in touch with young Jews who want to get this information, who are asking for it, at this particular level, is virtually nil in the Jewish community. The Jewish community has built up in its institutional structure an elementary school system, which is rather bad. Rather bad. And while the estimate is that some kid at some point in his life gets an education of about 40% of them, I think it reduces itself to anywhere between 2 and 4 hours a week at the maximum. On these campuses, the original role of teaching Jews about Jews and Judaism on the campuses evolved around the Hillel and the Newman clubs and so on in terms of the religious patterns of religious extracurricular activity. Today, the demand, quite apart from the ethnic studies and the black studies, demand on the part of students themselves to get information about Jews and Judaism has grown to such a point that if they're requesting it, and if this opportunity is given to us on the campus, I think we should make it available. Now, this is a question which has been very seriously debated, because the question originally was in any democracy whether religious training, we're not talking about religious training now, we're now talking about the training of a culture, whether it should be done on a supplementary basis, organized on a volunteer through volunteer agencies given to those who want it, or whether there is a right to use the legitimate instrumentalities of a public system and an educational system for this purpose. Now, you know, I don't have to tell you, it's argued on the ethic thing all along the line. I take the view that if there is a demand and if there is an interest on the part of Jewish students or other students who want to know about the culture of Judaism and the culture and the history of the Jews, that should be supplied to them in a manner which is compatible with the general educational structure. That's my view. Now, I'd like to follow your lead. Dr. Herman, would you want to add to that in any way?
Well, I think that if I have to answer the question as it is put, one would have to go very deep into the whole question, why one should be Jewish, why one should be others to be Jewish, why one should apply Jewish education at all. So I don't think this is the time to do that. I think that what you said...
Well, I just made a personal statement. And you have to regard us as recognizing that there are many views on the subject and so on.
Well, for me, it's of interest to know that the focus is toward Jewish students rather than students in general. In other words, there was some question on the line as to who the courses were focused on, what the purpose of the...
Well, look, let me give you...
Give me a better orientation.
Look, I mentioned the Bauman Fellowship. I mentioned that I was at the University of Washington. There's a man by there, and I mentioned his name, that's Professor Lecters, who is in Eastern European Studies. And there's a young student who came to him and said he wants to do a paper on Russian Jewry. Well, he didn't feel that he's qualified, but he felt that the thing ought to be explored in his work. And so he asked whether this student couldn't do supplementary work right here in Jerusalem. Now, this student spontaneously came. He had to supply an answer. Not every faculty man can handle all of the themes and subjects which are requested. And so this becomes a kind of a legitimate connection in this particular work. So.
My name is George Fletcher. Yes. I would like to make a brief plea against professionalization of this spontaneous movement in the United States. But I think one has to distinguish between professional Jewish studies and what one might call spontaneous interest in Jewish studies by people who are not experts in the field. And there really is an important difference. And I don't know exactly how to classify this chap in Washington. I don't really know whether he has a serious scholarly interest in Yiddish literature, or whether he's using the vehicle of a departmental course as a way to pursue his interest and perhaps his own rising Jewish consciousness. But that's a borderline case. But I think that there are a lot of people who interest me in the United States who are not professionally interested in Jewish studies as distinct from professionally interested. And these are people who might be drawn into interdepartmental courses, but I think that there are a lot of vices in doing that.
Where are you located?
I'm UCLA. I've taught, let me say that as a matter of background, I've taught two different types of Jewish courses. One course in a pre-university setting, and one was a professionalized course. The course in the pre-Jewish university setting was a course for which no one received any credit. Not at my home. People came generally.
UCLA, your free university?
Yes. I can give you more of the details later.
Will you?
The most interesting thing about it is that people came from the whole community, and we made a point of publicizing the course to the whole community. So downtown lawyers used to stop at my house on the way home, and people used to stop in. And now the group wasn't very settled. There was a changing population, but we had very interesting discussions, and I think it was a great success. It was taught jointly by a rabbi and myself.
What was the course?
The subject was comparative studies. My field is law, so the subject was comparative study of Jewish law and Western law. And it was attended by undergraduates, and I think it was a marvelous experience for me. Now, the following year, I taught a course and was in a professionalized setting, which was the pre-university by that time had become integrated in some kind of institutionalized experimental college at UCLA, which awarded credit for these courses. And that course was a disaster. I think the reason was that I taught it myself. That was the reason.
Well,
but the reason it was a disaster is, you see, I think there's a particular vice on UCLA, on college campuses in the United States, and I think it's probably true in Israel as well, that one believes that if something's worth doing, you get credit for it. And I think that's just a terrible misconception, and one ought not to encourage it. I think that there's much greater validity in spontaneous movements for which no credit is offered, which there are no syllabi, there's no required reading. People read what they want to read, they come and talk, and they study, and it's a much more personal, intimate setting. There's no talk about what kind of exam is going to be, and do I have to read this for the exam, or don't have to read this for the exam. Once you introduce all of this corrupt apparatus of the American university and the Israeli university, then you really have kettle of fish, which is not very pleasant. Now, I'm not talking about professional Jewish studies. I have greatest respect for people who are professional scholars in the field, and there are several people like this at UCLA who offer courses on Jewish history or on Jewish law. I think that's a totally different question. But I think that when you talk about a spontaneous movement now in the United States, I think you're talking about people who are interested in doing something on a part-time basis, who are pursuing these things, perhaps interested in the way Judaism relates to their field tangentially, but more interested just as people, not as professional scholars. And I think the effort to professionalize that could be very unfortunate.
Well, you see, now, if Arnie Band were here,
right,
he would argue the very opposite, wouldn't he?
I'm not so sure.
No?
I'm not so sure, but I can't represent his position.
No, I would say that, as far as I know his position, he has moved with great ability, but for whatever reason whatsoever, he has moved towards the development of a major in Jewish studies at UCLA. Isn't that so? And
yeah, I think my feeling is that it probably is a mistake.
Well, that's another matter. The only point I'm making is that Arnie Band, who has gotten this thing through at UCLA, has developed an entirely, that's the only point I'm making, that he would argue, as a matter of fact, I had a long discussion with him on the subject, and I heard the very opposite point of view. What, no, that's as simple as a fact, just take that as a fact, quite apart from the regular thing. What I recognize, we're not trying to create any movement. Let's keep to the question that I posed, where I think you can help us considerably, and that is assuming that there are variety, of approaches, and that they're all legitimate. You may argue against it on your campus. That's your responsibility. But assuming that there are a variety of approaches, and let us say the Free University. Now, in the Free University plan, one of the things, even in the Free University, even the kind of program which you're describing, materials have to be made available. People have to be knowledgeable in their subject. You teach law, but you're not teaching, let us say, Mishnah. Maybe you are, I don't know. I mean, in other words, but supposing there were a group of people who needed this material, or in our own field, in the fields which we're talking about, supposing somebody does want a course on the status and problems of Russian Jewry today. This is the kind of course that's being requested on many, many campuses. Now, literature, material, somebody has to prepare himself. That's what I'm talking about. In your setting. Now, again, I ask you, what would be our responsibility in this thing, if at all?
Well, I don't know. I think I'm not so sure that my point has come across with the importance of distinguishing between professional scholars and
well, I'm accepting yours.
And amateurs like myself.
I'm sorry, George. Professor Davis, I'm wondering whether the few minutes that we have left, whether we shouldn't give a chance to a number of people to crisscross discuss a sort of circular discussion, because to give everyone a chance to express himself rather than only this way.
Please.
Can we carry on for a few minutes this kind of discussion?
Will you conduct it then?
Yeah, because I would like to, you see, we are large.
You know the group,
yeah. We are a very large group, and we want, if people want to speak up, maybe we speak with each other, and then some members of the faculty and Professor Davis can then later comment. So let's see where we come. Don, you want to?
I hesitate to say this, I would not false modesty to say that I don't feel that the discussion this evening, with the agenda you stated, is reasonable. I don't feel prepared to address myself to the notion of models of curriculum, and at best, my personal feeling is I've just gotten acquainted with the Institute, and I think a discussion like this could take place at some other time and could make use of the expertise that is present in the room. But at this point, I feel I've just gotten acquainted, and at most it might be that providing us with information about what the Institute is doing would be the first step to permit me to begin to ask questions and engage in an intelligent discussion about the issues of the day.
Anyone else? Marvin, if you want to.
Well, he really said it. I thought that what was being presented tonight was step 3 in a process that has not gone through step 1. Namely, people have to really believe that you're offering resources for activities that people are not convinced they should engage in, and that's kind of difficult.
Is that true of all the people
No,
here?
I don't think it's true of all the people. It's true of some.
I say, but my question is it true of all the people here?
Yeah, we thought that maybe some people will have some input for the Institute in terms of their own experience. It may not be. Obviously, it sounds like, A, we don't have enough of the discussion, which means that people are not into it. And B, it may be what Don said, that the people really are not familiar yet with the Institute to begin with, to be able to even advise.
Right.
Which is quite legitimate. Anyone else? Joel and Elaine will have a family team.
With the Institute as a source material, would you please again explain the situation in the state as far as availability of source material? I come from Baltimore. We are very fortunate to have the Hebrew College as a tremendous source material. In fact, the Hebrew College professors and faculty were the ones who instituted the Jewish studies all throughout the college in Baltimore. We really, I believe, have in Baltimore no use for a source material here. We have it there. But so the situation not exist throughout the state is that we are unique in the fact that we have it here with us.
Well, I could answer it in this way, that Rabbi Smolar sent 2 of his students in his MA program to our seminar for World Jewish Service, and they're considering sending 7 of them this summer, because they feel that in order to get the kind of training in this specialized area, this is the one place they can receive it. So that I'm not willing to say that at this moment the situation in Baltimore is different than any other place in the United States. There are two centers that are operating in this area now. One is at Brandeis, the Lown Institute for Contemporary Jewish Studies, which still does not have the kind of documentary resources, but they certainly are building up a very significant faculty in this field of contemporary Jewish civilization. Another one was attempted at the University of Judaism in Los Angeles, but that has not really grown. So that I would feel that from the point of view of gaining insight and basic material here, this still is the place.
Michael?
I'll alarm people by offering a specific suggestion. But I can't possibly fit it into the framework that you offered originally, so I've been having difficulty addressing it. It seems to me that the one thing the letters you get and the requests you receive are the best indications of what you should do curricularly, it seems to me. And as far as structure of universities is concerned, it really is so idiosyncratic that I can't imagine that that's a useful kind of question. But there are two issues that I think would be helpful to American teachers in the social sciences, but they have to do with what you might call the universality of Judaism in its contemporary form. I would think that in the encouragement of scholarship in two particular areas, by example, would be useful for the introduction as materials that have Jewish connections in courses of general applicability. The two that come to my mind are the universality of the Zionist goal as an aspiration to people who are in a diaspora, and there are many, including Americans of African descent, the Armenians, the American Armenians, and so on. There's just a great deal of interest in ethnicity in America, and Zionism represents a possibility of comparative study that could be of considerable interest to people who are just interested generally in teaching in American politics and sociology. A second thought has to do with the kibbutz dream and the extent to which communal life and mini and small-scale socialist ideals have any viability in an industrial society. And it's the case in the latter that materials on the kibbutz are in great demand for teachers who want to shed some academic light on the concerns about the commune, thoughts on socialism, thoughts on utopia, and so on. And the encouragement of scholarship which would make specific comparisons in these two areas, I think would have applicability to the curricula in American institutions.
I'm really I'm grateful for this. This is exactly what I had hoped would be coming out in terms of the kind of suggestions. Of course, the person who is best qualified in this room to make some comment on your point is, of course, Yehuda Bauer. As far as I know, is the only member of a kibbutz on the Hebrew University faculty. So why don't you?
The answer is very simple. Such an institution exists. Ann Arbor, Michigan.
It wasn't a question, by the way.
It was a suggestion.
Suggestion, he said.
Suggestion. Ann Arbor, Michigan have set up a institute together with the Institute of Research in Israel of the kibbutz movement. So that exists. More or less, I won't say exactly, but more or less on the lines that you would.
See, but I think there's a problem for this institution because it's exclusively concerned with comparative Judaic studies. So when you, what I've seen, and and the situation may be misguided. So the question of the control group is germane because if you stay within the Jewish context, you may lose a capacity to be of universal interest and thereby gain access to those curricular components of American institutions that would build on it. I think, for example, and this is not a criticism of comparative Jewish demographic studies, but I can't imagine that a demographer is interested exclusively in comparative Jewish demography, except as a particular, well, I can think of some interesting questions there, but I'm sure it would be quite boring unless you painted that question against the background of demographic concerns in general. And I'm sure that work in Jewish demography would only be introduced in courses in American, in demography in American institutions if they had some kernel of universal interest in terms of demographic theory.
I quite agree with you.
Absolutely, we do agree with you.
Sam?
I hear this one too.
Oh, I'm sorry, Joel.
I like your second one, Mike said about the need for materials that fit into some kind of universal framework. It seems to me that there are two things going on in America. One is right now the rise of ethnic studies, as partially as a defensive reaction to the rise of black studies, and the proliferation of ethnic studies departments and courses of this nature, and courses in Judaism, Judaic history, and so on, sometimes fit into that band. The other thing that's happening now is a tremendous rise in the popularity of courses that deal with religion and religious thought. We have, in my department of history, we have a course given by a man that's not a specialist.
Where is that?
Into Carnegie Mellon University in history. Themes in Jewish history. He has the highest enrollment in the department next semester. The other highest enrollment is a course given in themes in Christian history, history of Christianity. There's tremendous groundswell of interest in religion and spiritualism, and we don't really know what this means. It's obvious that much of the interest in ethnic history is a defensive reaction to black studies and black movement. What does the religious movement mean? And you talked about getting on the bandwagon, taking advantage of this new interest. Well, I would be very suspicious, of taking advantage of it before I really knew what it meant. And that's why I think Mike's suggestion that comparative nature, universality, of these materials makes a lot of sense. To understand that as academics.
I agree.
Any other comment, suggestion? Oh, I'm sorry, Sam.
Very brief comment, not a question. And that is, there's two things. One, I don't know whether or not anybody else, but I think many of us in this room were never aware that there was an Institute of Contemporary Jewish. And I think that goes back to my comments earlier about the STAR system, that if you are interested not just in the proliferation of courses, etc., but in the proliferation of people who are interested in this, then and you wish Americans to begin to use your data sources, etc., and in some ways you have to not just be known to the stars, but begin to be known such that people become aware that such data is readily available and that you are willing to offer it and take care of it.
Would you have any thought as to how we could go about that?
Yeah, well, that comes to my second question, and that was that the Israeli sociologists are very well integrated and very well accepted throughout all introductory sociology textbooks. And one of the reasons for that is because while they were doing sociology in the Israeli context, or in the Jewish context, they were first sociologists, and they were doing good sociology of high standards. And therefore, sociologists who even were writing textbooks had to take into consideration their findings, their theoretical perspectives, etc. Because while they were interested in Israeli society and Jewish questions, they were first being sociologists of a very, very high caliber. So my point is that I then go back to my earlier comments again about the STAR system, that when you want to collaborate or you want to have a study done, it is very easy to call up Columbia or Michigan to get the study done. But I think in some ways you lose something. You lose something partially because I think that there are many institutions throughout the United States that are as high quality, but are not as well known. That possibly you might have to spend 3 months getting access instead of a week. You might have to look a little bit to find out who they are and where they are. But there are there are at least 10 schools in sociology, 20, where the professional work, the quality of the work that would be done for you would be as good as the one at Columbia, Michigan, but would not be readily known, let's say, to the people in the Department of Sociology at the University. When a student comes to me and asks me where he should go to school, he needs to show me a catalog with a reputation. Unless I know those faculty personally, I tell him I don't know what kind of education he's going to get if he goes to Columbia or Michigan. I don't know. I can tell him about the quality of what they've done in the past, but I don't know the quality of education. The schools such as Nebraska, Missouri, etc., that are in, I haven't gotten my degree in Nebraska, but Washington, St. Louis, Illinois, etc., that in particular areas are excellent, but which are not the stars. Now, I think that the problem is to begin to communicate to those small departments, which really aren't small. Many of them are departments of 20 and 30 people. They tend to all have some Jewish faculty. And they would love to have the opportunity to collaborate, etc. When you stick with the same kinds of institutions, mainly a Harvard, a Columbia, a USC, a Berkeley, and a Michigan, etc., while you gain access and easy availability, etc., I think you also do yourself a service if you are really interested in this area.
I think we most probably reached the point of no return, or return to the hotel. This has been a long day. This has been a long day for all these people. I would like to bring this long session to a conclusion. I think that the members of the faculty of the Institute should know that this seminar has spent most time, in terms of a session, with you. We've never had such a prolonged session in any program or on any subject. So, but on the other hand, I think we were rewarded. I speak for myself. I don't know how my friends feel, by the various areas of discussion which we had this evening, and certainly we have met people. This is another thing. In this particular program, we have had a group of people of the faculty that I hope, as they mingled with our seminar group, have gotten acquainted and have gotten friendly, and I hope as a result of that there will be contact, communication, correspondence, and as we learn more about each other, there may be more meaningful kind of contribution and input around the questions that you raised, Professor Davis. So on behalf of the group, I would like to thank you all, the faculty and you, for being such charming hosts and providing us with a very, very stimulating and very interesting evening and discussion. And to my fellow seminar members, I appreciate your sitting capacity. Thank you very much. Thank you. Very good comments came out of this.
I think so. I think a great deal.
I think Mike went and said, I'm going anywhere.